I'd like to walk us back through the Northern Renaissance, a little backwards. So, where the book begins with Germany, I want to begin actually with the other empire, as we'll call it. So that empire, of course, is the Empire of Spain, and the ruling family in the Cinquecento or the 16th century are the Habsburgs. So already they have many different holdings territorially in Europe. But if you remember the rhyme, in 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. He does that for the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. So the Americas are in effect added to the great empire of Spain, not just the Iberian Peninsula and other territories in the Habsburg family in what is now the Holy Roman Empire, later Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands, but also different Mediterranean territories that you can see in the kind of reddish pink there. Spain, of course, is full of pious Catholics, and they have a very strong tie to the Pope, to the Catholic Church in Rome. And also, thanks to that, and great leaders like Philip II, they have a connection artistically with Italy. So in a way, Spain and its empire is really the go-between between the High Renaissance of Italy and what we call the Northern Renaissance. Some of the downsides of Spain's influence, of course, are the Inquisition, expanding trade that leads to colonization and enslavement and exploitation of people on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly African communities and Native communities in what is today Caribbean islands and the southern United States and South America and Mexico and the rest of Latin America. However, we want to look at the world that really made this possible and the art that reflects that world, of course. We are going to get to know these great leaders, great empires, for better or for worse, regardless of, whether they do good or do bad, through the art that their court painters and others have created for them. So I said there's a strong tie to Italy, and that is partly through religion. So we're going to see the life of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, like you see here from El Greco, who, as his name suggests, he is Greek, but he works and lives in Spain. Portraits as well. In a way, this is also a portrait with Cantor Gaz down there, bottom center. We can expect, because of the tie to Italy, a great classical style, mimicking Michelangelo and Raphael and Leonardo, but El Greco here, as a later example, is definitely showing us the Mannerist influence in the empire. So this is the influence of the likes of Bronzino and Parmigianino, rather than just the High Renaissance masters. Exaggeration, particularly in religious content, was one of the ways artists and patrons dealt with the Reformation, dealt with the loss of power, loss of influence in certain corners of their empire, to Protestants who followed Martin Luther, for example. But style and exaggeration is also related to status. We've talked about that before. And the status of Spain and Spanish landholders especially, as rich in gold and silver and other resources that they are literally pulling from the ground that they consider New Spain, that was previously inhabited by completely sovereign people that didn't need to be taken over and in some cases obliterated and enslaved. it became part of their terminology. So plateresque decor, plateresque ornament of their architecture, and gilded tabletop treasures, all of that speaks to the richness of the Habsburg Empire by the time the year 1600 rolls around. So let's look a little closer at the burial of Count Rogas here by El Greco and see how we have in composition a rather high Renaissance split here into two, heaven above, the world below. The exaggeration is really going on in terms of form and texture and color, as well as a little bit in the space. You can see there, especially in the heaven part, hordes of people crammed in there. So we can imagine that pictorial space as much larger than the earthly space of the funeral down below. Zooming in on that heavenly space, we can see kind of a ghostly rendition of a view of the heavenly divine Christ, Mary, of course, as a bit of an intercessor, and other saints like Peter on the left there holding the keys to the kingdom of heaven. This is, of course, an entrance, a coming into heaven by the Count. It's essentially an illustration of the patron here, the good man, as El Greco is painting him, receiving his heavenly reward. And, of course, we'll get more into that in the video on Reformation. But hopefully you can see that what ought to be perhaps in a heavenly scene clouds, these rather silvery shapes on which sit Mary and the angels and the putti, they kind of switch back and forth between looking like water and looking like stone, looking like cloth or silk, especially compared to the robes of Christ up at the top center. So that is why I'm saying the exaggeration here is really in forms of texture and the form of the people themselves, the ghostly color. The rest of it is all quite textbook in terms of high Renaissance painting in general. You can see, for example, comparing him to Tintoretto's Last Supper, where we have the shift of a nice horizontal table to a diagonal one to add a little bit of drama and expand that pictorial space. And of course, the addition up top of the spectral spirits present at the moment when Jesus says, one of you will betray me, and sets all of the apostles buzzing. It's at one point a way of, again, upping that drama that leads us from Mannerism into the Baroque, but also, I think it puts more people in the space. It makes it a bit more relatable. There's more action, there's more narrative than Leonardo's, for example, rather quiet and staid example of Last Supper. In terms of, a gathering of people, if we want to consider El Greco as not only influenced by the Italian Mannerists, but by going all the way back to earlier masters like Masaccio from the Quattrocento. He's grouped people in a way where some are in full view, some are slightly obscured, others we only have a hint of a face or a nose. I'm thinking right over here on the right, where you just have a glimpse of somebody behind there. There's a very really realistic crush of people all attending this funeral here. And in particular, all of these are great noble men of the Spanish Empire, knighted to the Order of Santiago or St. James, as you can see. So there's a great deal of symbolism, a great deal of textural work on the bottom, the earthly side, that I think also point to not just El Greco's Italian influences, but the influences of the Northerners, like Jan van Eyck. That's why I'm starting with Spain as kind of our go-between. Also because I think Spain, in many ways in the textbook, takes such a back seat compared to Italy and then France. We'll give the Spanish culture a little bit of love here. So I mentioned Parmigianino. Let's put that in front of you so you have a reminder. This is Madonna with the long neck, where the Italian mannerist extends the bodily proportions of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child to give a sense of earthly elegance. Here, the mannerism is not necessarily for elegance sake, but rather for pathos, for emotional qualities, right? This is, of course, a funeral rather than a devotional image of mother and child. So we have not only that kind of ghoulish gray skin tone of Count Orgaz himself, but a rather ghostly figure on the left here, and a rather sinister or very staid, stoic-looking young man also directly looking out at us, which is always something to pay attention to in a Renaissance painting, pointing us to the focus. And in a Leonardo, for instance, that might not be necessary because his perspective, the converging lines, would lead us right to the focus. But with all of the swirling colors up above and the crush of people down below, El Greco gives us just a little bit more of a point to where the main action is. The Count himself, of course, framed, almost cupped in these two golden-robed figures here to, again, underscore, get the message across that this is the person being honored, being commemorated, rather like he's about to become like the Christ child on the right-hand side. He's about to, in some funerary terms, be welcomed into heavenly arms, right? So that's kind of why I've put these two up against each other. So we don't have necessarily this mannerism for the sake of elegance, but rather mannerism for the grief and sympathy for the patron, the man for which this is titled, Count Orgaz. Any good empire, of course, is going to have many of those great men in charge. There's a Viceroy of Mexico, there's all sorts of trusted deputies and lieutenants that rule this vast land that Spain has claimed. But of course, at the top is the king himself. And during this century, it is Philip II, and in the next century, it's Philip IV. Already, there are this royal family is dominated by actually an Austrian, Germanic line called the Habsburgs. So we have here in a palace a rather centralized and hard to miss cathedral and monastery. It is an entire complex in a giant grid plan. Hopefully you can see the little mini palazzos, these little squares that make up the body of the palace, almost like the whole thing is a gridiron. And I believe it's said that there is a saint who is martyred on a grill. I believe it's San Lorenzo. And so, in a way, the building itself is a symbol of martyrdom, a symbol of Catholicism. This would not really be the focus if not for the Reformation, if not for the existential threat and political threat posed by Luther, and by this time by England, led by Elizabeth I, by other Protestant powers that were already competing for land in the Americas, for control of trade. So this is really meant to make a statement that is not so focused on the ornament and the glitz and glamour of it, although you can imagine that inside, on the walls, on the tables, covered with gold and tapestries and paintings and jewels. Comparatively, it's rather unornamented, with just at the main portals, here, here, and here, columns and cornices and pediments in true high Renaissance style. This essentially becomes an extension of that idea of the square as the great earthly solid shape. This is essentially the earthly seat, where we might consider Rome and the Vatican the heavenly seat of power in terms of Catholic Europe. So if we look at El Escorial, here this is a drawing, it's a painting. The plan, though, by Juan de Herrera and Juan Bautista de Toledo, if we look at it from this view here, we get a much better look, I think, at the cathedral and just how it dominates the palace. This is one way of thinking about the Inquisition. That is, religion dominating the king, dominating the empire. The main point of the Inquisition was to root out heresy. The issue is, in the 16th century, heresy could be a lot of things. The Inquisition arrested people who are Jewish, and in Spain, those who are Muslim or still accused of, suspected of being of a different religion, even though they may have converted in public. Of course, they are going after Lutherans and Protestants, essentially trying to make Catholic Spain as Catholic and perfect as possible. But if you know any more history, you know that any such religious program inevitably leads to unspeakable crimes, torture and execution, murder and massacre. None of this is reflected in the shape here that we see in front of us. What we see again is the earthly shape of the square, the humanist classical ornament of the doors and the dome of the cathedral. What goes on within, the decisions made within, those are the things that affect not only people in Europe, but also the people of the African nations that are exploited and the native populations that are dislocated and exploited as well across the Atlantic Ocean. If we look compared to, I mentioned palazzos, so compared to an Italian palazzo at the top, looking down below to El Escorial, we can see that for a king, he gets a multiple. So essentially, 16 or 25 times as big as the Medici Palazzo in Florence. That is what is big enough, good enough to describe the power of the Spanish king during this century. That power, remember, comes from across the Atlantic. So we have here the portal of Casa de Montejo, Merida, Mexico, rather early in 1549. Maybe it's kind of hard to believe that a European presence was or has been on the continent for quite that long. But since 1492, Spain and people contracting with Spain, like Christopher Columbus, have been going back and forth, claiming land, taking enslaved people to work the land, and of course, monks, priests, the Jesuits have been going over to convert the natives. So that idea of richness in Mexico must also be coupled with the idea of civilization. Plateresque for us simply means in the style of silver, plata, from the Spanish for silver. That's where we get our word for plates that we use at the table. So on here, put up a example of what one might find on a well-appointed table in the Renaissance, we have almost the idea that the stone is embossed. See the very kind of low relief here, as if it is embossed, engraved, the way that one would work with a metal as opposed to working with stone. So all of this, in this case, shows two conquistadors, basically framing the coat of arms here. So we have some glimpses at humanism, some glimpses at the classical Corinthian engaged columns down here, but we've lost that pediment. We don't have any great arches or anything like that that we might see from St. Peter's, for example. This is definitely an extension of the Spanish aesthetic at El Escorial, translated to convey not only power, but civilization. This is why we are here. This is why we are converting you to Catholicism, because this way of life is better. Now, I don't want to just demonize the Spanish Empire. That is the logic of the English Empire, the British. Later on, it's the logic of the French and the Germans and the Belgians as recently as the mid-19th century. It continues to be the logic whenever we use phrases like First World and Third World, as if Europe and the United States of America know something that the lesser nations do not, and therefore must take care of them. It's a very almost parental concern with terrible, terrible results instead of what you might expect. So the other richness of the Spanish Empire, in addition to silver, plata, and gold, and other resources from the Americas and Africa, and so doing from Asia, the spices that Christopher Columbus was originally after, is art itself. You'll notice maybe as you go back through that many of these examples, even this one by a Netherlandish artist, Hieronymus Bosch, it is currently in the collection of Museo del Prado, the Spanish National Art Museum. And that is because of the Habsburgs and Philip II and the kind of voracious consumption of everything that is Renaissance, from the High Renaissance and Mannerism in Italy to this a very special brand of Northern Renaissance that Bosch introduces to us. The Garden of Earthly Delights is, as you can see, a triptych. It has 3 panels, 1, 2, 3. On the left, it appears that we have an Adam and Eve, along with Christ, depicted, perhaps making this Eden up here. We can read the centerpiece as the title. This is the Garden of Earthly Delights itself, and often the right panel is, with its darkness and flames and strange creatures, interpreted as a depiction of hell. Were you frustrated, though, with the explanation in the book? Because it doesn't really provide you with much of an explanation. That is because art historians still don't agree and still don't know exactly what Bosch intended. We're not even very clear on the commission of this painting. Who's the patron? Why was it made? There are a couple different ideas for that. Of course, the very first one is, it's a triptych, like the Maroda altarpiece by Robert Campin, where we have, 2 side panels and a main center panel. So could this perhaps be an altarpiece for a private chapel, something with religious aspects to it? And at a rather early date, 1505 to 1510, we're probably going to look for Catholic rather than Protestant notions. So standard for an art altarpiece are, on the left, donor portraits. We need to look for those, particularly not only donors like the Engelbrechts and Schrittmachers, but patron saints. We need to find, are there angels and other holy figures like the Virgin Mary herself and Joseph on the right-hand side? Is there a biblical narrative like the Annunciation involved? So let's go back and treat this like an altarpiece. This is Garden of Earthly Delights completely closed. So the outer two panels on their versos, their back sides, have kind of a smoky, dim glimpse at the world. So we might interpret this as creation. Perhaps, the first few lines of Genesis, where it is said that the Lord says, "Let there be light." He separates land and sea. He creates the animals and then rests on the seventh day, right? Open it up and we get the Garden of Earthly Delights. Anything biblical, though? Angels, Mary, Holy Spirit, a dove, perhaps. A lamb has been used as symbolism before. I see fish. I see strange kind of camel-like creatures, birds as big as people, owl creatures with many legs and arms there. Not so biblical, maybe. And what are these things back here, these blue and pink things? We have unicorns, pigs, cows. This is almost like a horse race back there. What is going on here, On top of that, there's some very unbiblical things going on. We have basically everybody nude, frolicking the way that nude frolickers might. It's a little risque. I mean, not full-on pornography, don't worry, but not exactly a glimpse at the Virgin Mary quietly reading in her room, is it? Put up the left panel. We have, we can maybe interpret this as Garden of Eden. We have elephant, giraffe. Okay, there's another unicorn over there. Adam and Eve, that makes sense, right? We have a cat who looks like he's walking off with his lunch. Animals doing what animals do, but another one of those strange pink fountain things. A landscape that is familiar, yet not quite. It's a little uncanny, right? A little strange. Add on to that, the right-hand side, we have this kind of tree man. We have other people who appear to be in great distress, not the frolicking that we've seen before. We have a knife with ears up here and a flaming city beyond. If this is a religious work, what's the message? Typically, remember, we read it as center first, and then left and right, like we did with the Marauder altarpiece. But if we read it as left to right, we have kind of the beginning, Garden of Eden, earth, and hell. Or could we interpret it as center first, garden, left heaven, right hell? So if you engage in those earthly delights, if you sin, you go to hell. If you do not sin, you go to heaven, where good people wait for you? Maybe. Looks like a lot more people are going to the other side, right? What else could be the explanation for this? Because of the nudity, because of the almost flirtatious nature of it, some people interpret this as maybe a marriage contract or a triptych to commemorate a marriage. Now, there's definitely plenty of references to being fruitful, reproducing. It's definitely a very spring-like mood in the centerpiece. So we might interpret the left panel with what we called Adam and Eve as similar to the Arnolfini portrait, where there's an aspect of posing in order to commemorate a contract, whether that is marriage or, in the Arnolfini case, maybe even more of a change in business where he's conferring power to his wife. That changes the whole notion of why Bosch would paint it. If he painted it for a patron who meant to give it as a gift for somebody's wedding, then maybe the nature of what's inside would be a little more private, a little less necessarily religious, and more comical or joyous or playful in that sense. But the marriage contract or marriage gift doesn't really take into account the other side, does it? Because we have this wonderful sunny side, animals, birds, everything seems to be spring-like and beautiful and romantic, and then there's the right-hand side panel. This is where we have to talk about alchemy. The third option is, this is a visual thesis about the nature of alchemy, which is the medieval forebear of chemistry today. Alchemy is a little bit science and a little bit mysticism, magic. One of the primary concepts of alchemy is transfiguration. And you might be familiar with that if you're familiar with Harry Potter. The idea of creating a substance, the philosopher's or sorcerer's stone, with which you can turn lead into gold and achieve eternal life. There were actual people who mixed chemicals and heated them up, boiled them, trying to create the philosopher's stone, trying to turn lead into gold. The main transition, the main change, of course, involved that fire that they would boil things on. So this right-hand panel, in a way, is the transitional alchemical state, where you are burning or boiling something in order to distill it, in order to change its phase of matter, say taking water from liquid to vapor. This change, the fire of burning or boiling, is almost sacred to alchemists. It is the magic of it. That is the magical thing. So while many of these alchemists are intentionally or unintentionally discovering the reactions that you and I learned in chemistry class, they're also reading into it something more otherworldly. Alchemists are also known to look into, to study, to read about astrology, how to read the stars and decide people's fate, as well as trying to contact the dead. So anything magical, anything occult you can think of is related to this. But for Bosch and his experience, it's something that in the 1500s is very real. Someone could someday figure it out and change lead into gold. We know, perhaps thanks to chemistry and physics, that would take a change in the atom. You would need to change the electrons. You would need to change the protons, right, in the nucleus to do that. That's not exactly what burning or boiling can do. So in a way, you could also read into this as almost scientific, almost showing you a worldview, where if we switch over from Bosch to Dürer here, and that's Self-Portrait of Dürer on the left, and the image that you open up the chapter with, he gives us also a glimpse at the world that focuses on not religion, but the secular aspects of the world, where Bosch shows us the alchemical and scientific elements, Dürer is actually showing us here in Melancholia the medical or almost psychological elements of his Renaissance world. Another element of that, and maybe you missed them, there were people who were not all white in Bosch's altarpiece, if we can call it that. Here's a drawing by Dürer himself of a young black man in Germany. The 1500s were a very cosmopolitan time, not just for Europe, but for Africa as well. There are real busy, economically prosperous kingdoms that European powers like Spain and Portugal happen upon, and for a while trade with. So there are delegations coming up from Benin, for example. There are people who trade and work and live in Europe who originally come from Africa. So it's really a big deal for us to remember that Europe at the time was not all white, as much as their idea of civilization, and that leads us to white supremacy, developed over the centuries. It would not have been strange to see, a black man on stage playing Othello, if you're familiar with Shakespeare, because Othello is a Moor, a black man from northern Africa. It would not be strange to, in a nativity scene, the Christmas story, see at least one, the tradition is one, of the three wise men or three kings is portrayed as black. A standard that becomes almost a nod to how the Islamic world wraps around and includes much of the continent of Africa. In some cases, these are just normal people. In some cases, they are enslaved. And in other works of art where we see black people, they are saints. So remember, if you studied any Art 2020 or earlier the ancient world, Christianity begins in the Roman Empire. And in corners of the Roman Empire like, Judea, Israel, Syria, Egypt, down to Ethiopia. So yes, there are black delegations and groups and communities in Rome, Italy. There are paintings, altars of saints that are black people in our churches. So just a little note there about how the world of Dürer and Bosch and Luther, it wasn't completely homogeneous, if we can use a chemistry term there. There was this mixture of people and a mixture of religion. The conflict between Lutheran and Catholic, for instance, yes, it caused a lot of violence, and there's all-out war going to break out by the time we get to the 17th century. But it also created movement. It also made artists go one country to the other, maybe to seek religious freedom. And it encouraged, in a way, trade and new alliances, like England, Henry VIII, looking for an alliance aside from Spain, aside from France, once he breaks with the Catholic Church. The aspect of the Africa that was, the Islamic aspect of it, I'm thinking particularly the Kingdom of Mali, and the schools they had, and the knowledge they had imparted from the Arab world, from Persia, from India. In many ways, medicine was more advanced in Asia and Africa than it was in Europe. Because until the 19th century, note that bottom line there, where we just started thinking about maybe there are germs involved in sickness. Imagine that. Western doctors, beginning with Hippocrates himself, the one who has the Hippocratic Oath, thought of the body as a balance of 4 humors. Humor not as in funny, but humor as in a fluid in the body. Where we have black bile, the melancholic or depressive humor, blood, the sanguine or active humor, yellow bile, the choleric or aggressive humor, and phlegm, not the same as phlegm today, the phlegmatic or reserved humor. And Melancholia 1 here, of course, he put it right in the title for you. Dürer is giving us a personification of the black bile or melancholic humor. This is the one that is often used to characterize artists. So we're also looking at the artist, the quintessential artist here of Renaissance Europe. And look at the mood here. Brow furrowed. Yeah, compass is in the hand, but we have other tools of the artist's trade down here on the floor. But is there any work being done? For example, is this block back here being transformed into a great work of art? Not at the moment. The Pooty, the cherub in the back, looks to be doing a bit more work than Melancholia, the artist, is right now. Characterizing artists this way, not only as depressive, but I think the book uses the term saturnine. So almost, we would describe that more as having bipolar disorder with manic highs and depressive lows. So this is definitely the artist on a low here, perhaps. Inspiration is not flowing, work is not being done. You can think of this almost as the personality tests we have online, right? You know, which character on this show are you? Or astrology. What's your sign? And for the artist, typically, their humor was black bile. It said that they had an excess of that fluid compared to blood, yellow bile, and phlegm, and that made them the way they are and explains their behavior. Also associates them, the way astrology does, with all these other characteristics. 4 humors means you could connect them to 4 seasons, right? Spring, summer, fall, winter. You can connect them to not just the moods, depressive, active, aggressive, reserved, but to other expectations about the person in their life. And doctors, people in Europe and America believed this up until the 1800s. The humors appear in Dürer's Fall of Man as well. Both of these engraved with a burin, a nice sharp tool to cut these wonderful, precise lines into the copper. And he's a true northern artist because he's using textures and lovely contrast of value here to disguise symbolism. A symbolism that at once is very Christian because of the use of Adam and Eve, but also very secular because of the use of the 4 humors. We can see Renaissance proportion in this Adam and Eve. I mean, look at them. They are perfection in Renaissance terms. Don't get mad at me. In contrapposto, where we have Adam's pop of the knee here, and by contrast, the opposite knee of Eve. All of this, the wonderful attention to making bark look like bark, and their wonderful curly hair, is almost a distraction from details like his signature up here with the lovely parrot. The animals down here, we have the choleric or aggressive cat, the sanguine or active rabbit. Over here, the reserved or phlegmatic ox, and the saturnine or depressive melancholic elk in the center. All animals you might expect in a forest or, in the oxen's case, farm setting. More importantly, though, is where they're positioned. So look at the balance of humors. Are they balanced visually? A little skewing to the side, right? The Eve side, particularly the active and aggressive, are right there in the middle, but they're pointing to Eve. The cat has its tail almost wrapped around her foot as he's eyeing up this poor little mouse down here on Adam's side. So we can interpret a lot into this. Ladies, you might not like to hear that sometimes the story of the Garden of Eden is interpreted to put Eve in a rather harsh light. She is tempted by the serpent there, winding up the tree, giving her the apple, and yet she becomes temptress, giving the apple to Adam. So she is the cat, Adam is the mouse, about to be caught. Also on her side, though, is the reserved ox, and back behind Adam is the elk. So we kind of, well, who is this Adam anyway? We have all of the personality descriptors on Eve's side, and all Eve's got is a little bit of the elk here, so he's just a little bit depressive. Adam's sad. See how far we can take it? If you don't want to get too far into interpretation, and particularly Durer's interpretation of the Garden of Eden story in maybe a little bit of a feminist analysis, also look at the painstaking effort to make the pictorial space so vast. We have a papa sky up here with a cliff and a mountain goat, scaled so we know that there's miles between us, right? There's so much space out there. There's a whole big world, right, that Adam and Eve are about to be cast into. As Masaccio portrayed it in the Brancacci Chapel here, where we had maybe a little bit of abstraction in the body and the form on the left, but a great deal of expression. See how Durer's traded that expression for symbolic interpretation and heavily humanist, heavily Greco-Roman body type. Influenced by people like Pollaiuolo and the study of anatomy in the Quattrocento, all the way down to, where is it? There they are. Influence of particular sculptures. Adam is often compared to the Apollo Belvedere there on the left, while Eve, of course, is found in the various versions of Aphrodite or Venus, goddess of love. Note that these two gods are not usually associated together. Venus is usually paired with Mars or Ares, god of war, her husband in the myth. Apollo is essentially her half-brother. God of light, God of wisdom and the muses. So I think the choice there is still rather telling as to how Dürer feels about Adam versus how he feels about Eve. All of this, the mixture of mythology and a rather bookish academic look at Catholicism, plays into how we can characterize France. Not to downplay France, but it'll get plenty of attention in the next chapters. Francis I is still in the process of restoring the kingdom's former glory after basically 100 years of war with England. They remain staunchly Catholic to the point that later in the century there is the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Night, where the Protestants of Paris are obliterated in bloody, violent style. Francis I uses his Catholicism, like Spain, like Philip, for political gain. But let's not discount him. He's probably a man of true faith too. But they wield it like a hammer against England once Henry VIII breaks with the Catholic Church, against the people of the Americas, converting them with the use of the Jesuit priests to Catholicism. And all of this power that he's amassing, playing these cards of, wealth and religion against his rivals, here kind of personified in his golden salt cellar that was just for Francis's salt on his table, created by a Mannerist Italian workman. All of this is embodied in those huge sleeves, big, broad shoulder. This is the kind of man that Henry VIII wanted to be. And he was, at times, rather jealous of Francis I, too. So Jean Clouet is painting his master, painting his king, in a way that we might say is a little less than realistic, a little less than humanist, because we have a heavy outline in places, especially the very profile nose here. And I think that turn of the head is a way of kind of dealing with the nose. And definitely it's very much a kind of a head painted on almost hesitantly to this giant billowing coat that is a mass of silk and gold thread with a brocaded fabric behind, velvet under his hands at the bottom of the panel. This is all not an answer to the High Renaissance, because compared to the Mona Lisa by Leonardo and the sfumato, the expert blending, and Clouet doesn't have a prayer holding up to one of the High Renaissance masters. But Francis I, who had Leonardo come up to his palace in France, and that's why the Mona Lisa is today still in Paris at the Louvre, would have wanted in his portrait something maybe a little less humanist and a little more propaganda. So all of this is meant to exaggerate in the right places. The broad shoulders, the chest, the fabrics, even kind of the jaunty cap with the delicate feathers, all of it is sending a message that is about his power resurgent. Notice he has his hand on the hilt of a sword down here. But it's also a little reserved. Remember, because he's playing his cards right. He has to, at one point, be a friend to England and an enemy to Spain, and then all of a sudden, enemy to England and friend of Spain, in order to survive, because he's wedged in between the Protestant and Catholic areas of Europe. His real power, though, is flexed in his buildings, like the Cour Carrée, the square court of the Louvre in Paris, by Pierre Lescot. So the Louvre is a castle, and this was to make it a bit more like a palace, a bit more like a residence rather than a fortress, with very classical columns and arches, not unlike El Escorial. And we can already see a very French treatment of these classical types, like the pediment and the columns and arches, in their repetition and in the shape of the roof above. So there's going to be a very particular name, the mansart roof, for these quintessentially French designs in the next centuries. Another glance, there's the Louvre in illuminated manuscript form, again, castle with turrets and battlements and crenellated walls. We're going from a fortress necessary because of England's war to more of an Italian palazzo in the Cour Carrée, because now he no longer needs to fear invasion. He no longer needs to worry about such things. And so the real expression of it can be the decoration on the outside. We can see all sorts of muses and classical figures in these niches in between windows and along the main entrance up at the top under the pediment. All of this is a big message that Francis I is a humanist, powerful, and in his political dealings also staunchly Catholic. Note that by now we've kind of solved the Alberti problem of putting a new classical face onto an older building. Because Lescot was able to build an entire new court, he didn't have the problem of the pediment proportions of his Greco-Roman style getting in the way of the older medieval structure, like poor Sant'Andrea and the nave height versus the perfectly Quattrocento square arched entrance there. Too, we can see a little bit of Brunelleschi, a little bit of Michelangelo in the not only the repetition, but how repetition is broken up, how the eye is kind of led around and given something to do, not just in terms of changing pediment type from triangle to circle, like here on the interior court, but having a series of true arches paired with blind or windowed arches, and really just breaking up the proportions level to level to level, so that we have a sense, again, in a palazzo of the first level being the street, right? Anyone can get in. The upper levels, though, are more refined, more private, more separated from the world of the street, or in this case, the court. Sorry, my subtitles are having to catch up with me, so hopefully it's not too difficult to read. So let's finish up with the Netherlands here. Notice how in this map they are completely part of the Holy Roman Empire, and that is how they come under the rule of Spain through the marriage of the Spanish royal family and the Habsburgs. But when we say Netherlands, we're talking about Holland, up here, Belgium, and Luxembourg down here. This is a very important part of Europe geographically, because this is where the Rhine River meets the North Sea. So it's very important for trade and shipping. Places like Antwerp also become banking centers. That's why we have such an array of rich patrons for our Northern Renaissance artists to work for. The influence of Luther, who nails his 95 Theses over here in Wittenberg, is very strong, especially in Holland. So this is where, again, the Spanish Empire has the most trouble to keep Catholicism on top and not to lose such a rich province, because it's full of the merchant class, it's full of peasants and agriculture. This is where, of course, it's known for its tulips, but also linens. It's a great kind of very central place in Western Europe for goods and money. So if we're to seek independence from Spain, and it achieves such in the next century, is, a sign of the declining Spanish power. So we'll end with the Netherlands because they're the ones that kind of very quietly come out of the 1500s, the Renaissance, as a true world power. Again, downside, they're heavily involved in the slave trade. Later involved with, things like the Dutch East India Company and colonization on their own. The Dutch, remember, buy the island of Manhattan and found New Amsterdam that becomes New York for, pennies to the acre. Essentially, the story goes that they ripped off the local tribe. Again, downside, but upside. We know this, we get a glimpse at this, we get to know them through their art. So better or worse, the world of the Protestants in Holland. You'll see kind of genre scenes of peasant life, and as we get more Protestant, fewer altarpieces. Because one of the tenets of Protestantism is that you don't need as much imagery. The focus is on the text, on the word, as we'll see. So here, almost to replace or to work in some of the work that altarpieces did, artists like Peter Aertsen are working in symbolism of the Holy Family. So we have Mary here and Joseph and the tiny baby Jesus on the move. There's a part in the Gospels after the Christmas story where they are going into exile in Egypt to get away from King Herod and keep the baby safe. There's other religious symbolism here that you might not be quite so aware of. The crossed fishes, not just the cross itself, but the inclusion of the fish. There's a miracle Jesus performs where he multiplies a few loaves of bread and a couple fish to feed 5,000 people who come to hear him speak in Galilee. There are pretzels, which we might not bat an eye at. This is the Dutch, for example, but it's also an example of bread, communion, the symbolic body of Christ. Amid the butcher's stall, of course, has all this meat. So we have real, very, almost too real depictions of birds, chickens, pig, cattle. Let's not look at this too long. But naturalism here is used to definitely create a bit of a contrast between the little Holy Family vignette we peek through the stall to and the actual products. In 1551, though, this would be seen as a sign of this is good economy. This is the world working like it should. And this is how you would buy meat back then. So the illusion, the surface description here, like Van Eyck, like Robert Campen, is used to wow and relate to the viewer. Another Protestant scene with kind of a hidden moral is Quentin Mass's Money Changer. So it's usually, again, kind of an Adam and Eve dichotomy here. We can split it right down the center. And look at the center there. There is a mirror. Just like someone looking out at us, someone pointing, or someone in the nude, someone with wings. That's a dead giveaway that there is symbolism to be interpreted in this painting. The lesson, of course, with the Money Changer is greed, warning away from greed with these subtle symbols. The mirror, let's start with that one first, and let me get rid of my marks, is a tiny miniature of the opposite window that shows a glimpse. Maybe you can just barely see the steeple of a church, and just how tiny the church is, not only in the composition, but also in the mind of the money changer and his wife. There's a door in the background that also peeks to the outside world, but is the world of gossip, people speaking to each other, not the world of the pious or the religious. The wife herself has, I think, maybe the most important religious symbol, the prayer book, where she's flipping the pages like maybe some of you do, but see here she has a Madonna and child on the page she's about to come to. She's not looking at it, is she? Where is she looking? The money. Of course, it's his job to weigh money. Back in the day when all they had was coins, and you had coins from another place, another country, you would weigh them to ensure that you have a good exchange rate. It wouldn't be enough to just go by what the coin said, because you needed them to be real silver, real gold, and not fake. So that's why he's weighing them with his scale here. Here's the two dishes of the scale. That also hints to us, things are being weighed against each other, the secular versus the religious. So in their daily lives, they would still have prayer books. They would still have prayer. They would still have sayings. I mean, even the way we say goodbye from the Old English, basically, go with God, God be with ye. We still say that today. We still things like bless you when someone sneezes. So even in a secular world like ours, and of course theirs, there's still going to be remains of that kind of very more rigid structural Catholic dogma that they had. But this painting here replaces art in the churches. This art would maybe be more suited to, someone's house. This wouldn't necessarily be an altarpiece, because in the church, the pastor or the reverend would instruct the faithful. The Bible would instruct the faithful. And out in the world, the art would also take up that mantle, not as a partner of Scripture, not as an embodiment of, the Madonna and Child, for instance, but almost as a subtle reminder, right? Kind of a prompt where, hey, maybe look away from all these riches, even this wonderfully done glass jar here with the right amount of reflection of light and translucence, the pearls on velvet down there, all these things that he can count and take a percentage of and make money. Are they as important as the church in the mirror? Are they as important as the Virgin Mary on the page? So we always want to, again, make sure we know and acknowledge that there's more to the world of the Renaissance than what maybe we're used to reading in books. So there are people of all skin colors, and there are people of all genders too. So here's our female artist of the chapter, Catharina van Hamessen, one of two this time, and her self-portrait in 1548. Women, though, still are limited to where they can go. Usually not out on their own without, a male relative or some other escort. It just, in some cases, wouldn't be safe. And also would not be appropriate for them to paint or sketch a model. In this case, we have Caterina modeling for herself, painting herself, just as Sofinisba Anguissola painted her little sisters and brother. So we do tend to get more domestic scenes from these female artists, but already maybe on her easel you can see Caterina at work, balancing her hand on that mahl stick there, at a portrait, maybe something a little more lucrative in terms of her career. So she's one of the artists who, they're just now kind of getting their due. They're just now getting more research done in art history, these females like Sofonisba and Caterina, where we can see that, especially if you could get a place in court, or in Caterina's place, especially if the world around you is changing so that more secular portraits and scenes of everyday life are what the people want, she is in prime place to sell her art. In a way, we can see this portrait as just as much of a statement as The Man in the Red Turban, which often is interpreted as a self-portrait of Jan van Eyck, where in Latin it says essentially, Jan van Eyck made me. So Catharina van Hamessen made me. It's a testament to her skill, an advertisement for herself. Also note that lovely velvet sleeve there. That's not the dress she's actually going to paint in. So we have status as well as talent portrayed in this self-portrait. Compare her to the other female artist, Levina Teirlinck, and we're going to go ahead and just give her the attribution for the portrait of Elizabeth I as a princess. And we can see almost an identical color palette, right? With, of course, more bright pinks and golds used for the princess to display her fine fabric, her prayer book, and all of the pearls on top of her headdress surrounding her beautiful red Tudor hair. The book in the background might be blank, but all of this again is to show Elizabeth as learned, as pious. And in 1559, that would have been quite important. Once Henry VIII dies, each child who takes over as king or queen tries to reverse the religious decisions of the previous one. So England goes back and forth, Catholic, Protestant, and that does not mean just a change in which book you read. That means people are getting burned at the stake for what they believe. So you are looking at a princess in armor. Her armor is her status, her riches, her knowledge of books, not only languages like Latin and French, but scripture itself. That is her protection. That is how she survives. So in a way, we're looking at the next chapter in England's history. This is the one who takes over as queen and creates a golden age of exploration and exploitation of the Americas, but a golden age to be sure. The connection between England and the Netherlands is in part because of this new kind of Protestant secular world where art can be everyday scenes like The Hunters in the Snow here by Peter Bruegel the Elder. This is from a series of 6. That might bother you a little bit. We might be expecting 4, right, for the seasons and the humors. But it does go through kind of a relationship of man to nature. So there's 2 extra paintings, but it goes through the cycle of the year and shows us outdoor scenes of his homeland, the Netherlands, focusing on simple people, the hunters with their dogs. It's optically accurate. Can you see some things that you might not call necessarily realistic? Shapes of the dogs in some places, the change of scale, perhaps. Maybe the way the snow is drawn and the way the tree branches are drawn are a little too crisp. All of that speaks to, again, a northern sense of perspective. This is not linear perspective at work. This is Peter Bruegel doing it the northern way, where we have maybe a more natural and, what's another good word for it, a holistic approach. So we don't have a single vanishing point. We do still have a horizon line. That is kind of the typical 2/3 up the painting. And we're just gradually taken back from the foreground in the lower left, middle ground, background. You can follow the trees and the hunters themselves because it creates this wonderful rhythm that carries us into the depth of pictorial space. Or you can also read the houses that take us down the slope to people skating on the ice down there, even women in their aprons taking a break, perhaps even some ice fishing. So we have here kind of a glimpse like the peasant, the serf, in front of the Louvre by the Limbourg brothers. In fact, do we have that? There we are. Not for the consumption of a great man like the Duke of Berry, not for its associations with the month of October, not for any sense of astrological significance, but as a way for art to imitate life and for life to imitate art. Because now what the artists are working on is what is around them, what they see, in the style of their region, to be sure, as you're looking at Dutch on the left and French on the right. Both Dutch here, both Netherlandish. Another glimpse, again, a reminder that it's more typical for a non-Italian painter in these earlier years to approach perspective not so mathematically, but more artistically. where we do believe in the illusion of space on the left and the right. We also may perceive some distortions, especially if we compare to an Italian like Brunelleschi using linear perspective. But remember, we're not looking at correct and incorrect here. This is a regional difference, a regional style that lasts throughout the century, despite the influence of Italy, despite the influence of Spain, which ruled Bruegel's homeland during this time. So we get to end a little bit to where we began with the Bosch, with Bruegel's Netherlandish proverbs. Again, changing from altarpiece style, religious style art to the secular involves bringing in all sorts of new source material, like proverbs. Think of Ben Franklin, right? Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Axioms and old sayings. That's what we're talking about here with the Netherlandish proverbs. These are all also, they tend to be proverbs about wisdom versus foolishness. In fact, one of the main ones is right on the horizon line, barely a focus in the painting. The blind leading the blind on a cliff. This is one that Bruegel revisits over and over again. So we have the blind leading the blind. We have a man hitting his head upon a brick wall. A man firing a crossbow and missing nothing and missing everything. So all around you, you see folly. You see foolishness. And that, in a way, is the northern brand of humanism. Avoiding foolishness, focusing on sense and reason and the mind. The distraction, what can get you into trouble, is sin, earthly delights, as Bosch calls them. So in a way, we have the much more make-believe, imaginary, moral Northern Renaissance painting on the left, and the fully formed, secular, moralizing Northern Renaissance painting on the right-hand side. So what we've done, we've established kind of a difference in terms of region as well as religion. And so we're going to continue thinking about how religion influences art, Reformation versus Counter-Reformation, as well as today.